because they have one doesn't necessarily mean that we need one, but certainly where we all need one, it would be ideal to have them as consistent as possible.
Tim?
Just with regards to the summary of findings, if they're a wee bit here.
Sorry, the
Which
summary,
one?
Yep, your one.
From that handed out, the stuff that we're given on Friday, this
Which chapter are you talking about?
commercial.
No, we're not onto that yet.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're just doing the definitions.
Okay.
So if we're all done on definitions and glossary, one more from Glenn.
Sorry about this.
No.
Just under sheltered housing there, the last line, but not where residents are detained on the site. So obviously, that means as in permanent residents. Is that?
No. That's to do with, for example, somebody detained under the mental health legislation or something like that. Would that be right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So as long as they're not being detained under legislation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That's very good work, and let's see if we can reduce the number of definitions that we need, if we can. I'm very aware of the legal issues around it, but if we could make it as simple as possible, it really would be, I think, quite a relief to everyone, including the lawyers. Great, thank you.
We probably won't know until we've completed phase 2 as to
No,
the extent
I know.
to which we've
Yeah, I know, because it's all got to connect together. But it is a fundamentally important chapter, and I think I've made a few flippant comments about definitions, but we have to get the definitions right because they are the backbone really of the whole framework. So, yeah, thank you very much for all your hard work. And now, who did we want to have next?
Thank you.
Was it
Mark Stevenson on the commercial chapter.
on the commercial chapter? Okay, so we've got a section 32 report, and we've got the draft commercial chapter in front of us. And we've got Mark, who is going to go home immediately after this presentation. On the Mayor's instructions.
Can't do better than that.
I'll let my wife know.
Good. Right, would you like to take us through this?
Certainly.
A slide, please, Claire.
Oh, slides, right.
Linda.
Just on the screen there's a summary of some of the key issues that have been raised through the consultation over the last 5 weeks. There's a more... the table that was sent to you on Friday, I believe, provides a longer list of some of the points raised, and what's on the screen is just a snapshot of some of the issues I've pulled out. The first of those is a concern about the focus in the commercial chapter on support for the central city and our larger suburban centres. A comment made in that respect was that there's not enough being done for smaller local centres. I'll come on to explain shortly how that's being addressed. The second issue was really about businesses that have temporarily relocated to suburban locations outside of commercial areas. So we've seen, as you'll be aware, there's been a significant relocation of businesses. There's in the order of 800 approvals that have been given for businesses to temporarily relocate, and a proportion of those will return to central city or to other commercial centres, but a number of those want to stay where they are, and I'll come on to that shortly. Third issue is really about urban design. Not long ago we had a meeting with a number of large retailers, Westfield, Progressives and Kiwi Property, who own some of the large malls, and their concern is that the provisions aren't flexible enough to recognise the functional requirements of those businesses, that they have a specific business model and generally speaking have a larger format to their business than smaller scale retailers, and therefore a greater need for car parking, for loading areas, and so they're opposed to the requirements for an urban design assessment, but also requirements for glazing for build-up of buildings to the road front and so forth. Concern regarding the scale of commercial development that's allowed at the interface with residential properties, and what we've done is reviewed where there is a boundary between a commercial zone and a residential zone, particularly the commercial core zone, which provides for a larger, taller, bulkier scale of development, and looked at reduced height limits at that interface to avoid residents who currently adjoin those commercial areas, avoid them having to face a large blank wall. Comments about the new, a large number of comments through the public meeting and in writing about the new centre at North Hallswell. Just pulling out one of those comments, there was concern about the scale of retail and office development that's provided for in that centre. Just to refresh our memories, the rules would, that in the draft that went out for consultation, enabled up to 60,000 square metres of floor space, which is of a scale to, similar to Northlands or Hornby, even Riccarton. And then just a final point on the new centre at Belfast, which is so south of the super centre. There's a greenfield site which is been rezoned in the current city plan for a new commercial centre, and the owners and proposed developers of that centre opposed the restrictions on retail and office activity in there. Those restrictions were put in place to support recovery of the central city. Next slide. So just touching on three of those issues. The first about the focus on the central city and large centres. I understand there was some discussion about this yesterday, but there's obviously a direction in the Land Use Recovery Plan in Chapter 6 of the RPS for us to treat the central city as the primary destination for a range of activities and in effect to give primacy to it. But it's not, we've been cautious that we don't want to put all, to say to the market, anything large has to go in there. We believe there's a balance to be achieved. So we're also providing for large retailers in our larger centres, so the Riccartons, Hornbys, Northlands, but also large format centres like Tower Junction, like Blenheim, Morehouse Avenue and so forth. Really the chapter's focused on enabling small scale activity in the smaller centres to avoid development that's out of scale with its context. So an example I've given at a public meeting has been of a large office block going up in the middle of Maryvale or Bishopdale that's going to look out of context with the existing built form, but also the scale of the surroundings. So it's about managing the appropriate scale of development according to its context as much as anything. It's not saying that we want to direct all large scale to one location. It's about also recognising what's there and what we want it to look like. Having said that, in respect of offices, one of the key issues was concern about restrictions on office developments in to the central city and suburban centres, and I'm sure we'll come on to discuss it shortly, but we are also providing for offices in defined office parks, and I'll comment on that. There's a rule which permits office development within recognised office parks. We're still providing for small-scale offices in other locations, but commensurate with the function of that zone. The focus of the chapter is on providing for their return to commercial centres, but obviously there's going to be issues, and so there's obviously a lot of existing. The last few years there's been provisions and still is provision for office buildings to go up in suburban areas, industrial zones, and they'll still serve a need for accommodation for those businesses. We're not saying that every single office-based company has to be in a centre in the future. In respect of temporary relocation, there are some businesses that have relocated on Papanui Road, for instance. There's Metro Cafe and shops beside it, midway up between here and Maryvale, and they've recently been granted resource consent to stay there on a permanent basis. So what's tending to happen now is that businesses like that are applying for resource consent to stay there longer term, and that perhaps reflects the investment that's been put into...
Was that done on a notified basis?
Yes, it was. It was
Yes,
limited,
it was.
limited notified.
Limited to what, neighbours? Or?
Yes, neighbours in the vicinity, yes.
And that was supported by the local neighbours?
Yes, my memory of it was one neighbour in opposition, a number in support, went to an independent decision maker. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, I mean, I know that area very well. I sort of grew up in that area, but I just know, I mean, the reason that I sort of kind of prick my ears up when you use that as an example is we were discussing that yesterday. And it is not a location where you would put a group of 3 or 4 shops. You wouldn't, because it's right on the edge of a street coming off Papanui Road, which is one of our main arterial routes, and it's a block away from the Merivale Shopping Centre, which used to be known as the St Albans Shopping Centre. Yeah.
I'd be really interested to understand what our traffic assessment said about that.
We can come back to you with those details about that particular consent if you like.
I think one of the concerns is that sometimes we don't, I mean, it just seems really hard to understand how you could get evidence that would support that being a good permanent outcome in terms of experts. And
I think what we're getting is that actually the temporary becomes the permanent, and all of the advice that we've received internationally tells us that this is what happens. Correct. And it warns us of be careful around the temporary because it becomes the permanent, you know. And you know, I mean, my slight you know, sort of relaxation about this is the fact that it wasn't completely unnotified, which would have devastated me, I think. But the fact that, you know, with one exception, the neighbours are willing to accept that. But it does put pressure on the transport network, and you know, you sort of, you know, I mean, I know the businesses in there. You know, one of the ones was a clothing shop. You know, that was destroyed in the high street. You know, and you know, and there's tragedy associated with that destruction. So, you know, I'm totally supportive of the businesses that have relocated and established there, but it does warn of the planning effects, the ongoing planning effects of the temporary becoming the permanent.
I certainly agree with what you're saying, which is why there's a need to have this process completed as soon as possible for the proposed plan, because it's in fact what it does is relook at all of these effects and issues.
Can I just make a quick comment around that one? Because obviously it's now patched there. I think it was pre this council being sworn in. I remember when they were originally opening this up there, and there was a massive groundswell, and I think I basically had about every person on Merivale Lane emailing me and ringing me 3 times under different pseudonames and everything, probably too, opposing it, saying that it was just the worst thing that could possibly happen. And, you know, there was going to be a licence associated with Metro there, and I think they sort of envisaged it being like Aikman's or something like that. And I think actually now, yes, I admit there are some places where they haven't integrated that well, probably around the airport business parks and everything like that. They're probably, you know, not on Christmas card lists around there. But the likes of Metro, I think, bar that one person, I think a lot of people go, do you know what? It actually adds a bit of value. I quite like being able to go down and have a coffee there. And I think that it's been generally pretty well accepted. Yeah, the parking could be better. There's also other places that I look like working style, for example. In my view, you know, another one in our patch, I think that adds value. I think what we've got there is better than what was there before. And yes, there might be the odd sort of vested interest neighbour or something that might pipe up. But for the greater good, some of these things, I would love them to be in the CBD, but I actually think if they're not, it's not the end of the world. It's like a wee Parnell or Newmarket, and I think it adds so much value there. I think, you know, that those sort of temporary becoming permanents are good for Christchurch in a lot of ways.
And what we're hearing around the table is, of course, that it's a business by business, site by site decision that needs to be made on a consent, which is why we have those rules in the strategic direction that mentions the sort of flexibility on that.
Phil?
In relation to issues like that, though, I'm just concerned about the incremental effects. And like, while one coffee shop might not lead to major traffic disruption on Papanui Road, the total, when it's gradual and incremental, people get accustomed to that, and then suddenly we're in gridlock. And so that's where, in terms of the link between this part and the transport chapter, is going to be, I think, really important.
Yes.
Yeah. Tim and then Glenn.
Following on from that, it's also what is partly killing our neighbourhood shops, because if, for instance, if you take Colombo Street at the bottom of the hill, you've got two sets of neighboured shops. One is at the bottom of the Cashmere Hill, the other one is Beckenham. And then you've got a smaller one thrown in the middle. But if you go in between those, you've got little bits and pieces happening. They're getting resource consent. A couple were given prior to, and prior to the earthquake, we were having concerns about places like the Beckenham shops and others actually surviving, and why weren't they? Were the malls killing them or whatever? But I do think it's the chipping away and allowing things for better or for worse, but we can't have one without the other. So, you know, we either do one or we don't. I mean, it's the balance.
That also relates to the discussion we had with the Deputy Mayor yesterday when we were trying to talk about having a network in place of different sizes of centres, and there's this issue about innovation and sort of freeing things up, but there are also the effects of that on other centres that are already established. And this is the issue that we discussed yesterday. This is why Mark's going to talk through how he's dealing with this.
So,
Glenn?
sorry.
Yeah.
It's just to add housing too, in that respect, the Tenants Protection Association has wanted figures over changed use from that which has now become a temporary relocation of a business, given the loss of inner city housing in the inner city east and other areas, and we talked about this yesterday. So I know you're saying it's on a site-by-site basis, but if I hear that over and against temporary becoming permanent.
Yeah, and I apologise, I'm going to get to you today the list of temporary activities and where they're located, and that's slipped my mind, but I'll follow that up today.
Yep. Andrew and then Yanni.
Thank you. Comparing the map on planning map, draft planning map 52 with the map on page 154 of the draft commercial chapter, referring to the Banks Peninsula commercial zone, this area is reduced in size. The area of the south part of Norwich Quay is actually no longer included in the Banks Peninsula commercial zone, whereas the broad understanding was that the size of that zone would be remaining the same. So my feeling is this one has gone under the radar a little bit. It has been picked up by people who own commercial buildings which are requiring repair in that existing Banks Peninsula commercial zone that will then fall outside of that area. The port have bought up some land there, and clearly there's an intention for them to start using that land for port purposes. But the couple of site owners that are still wanting to use that area in line with the commercial zone are feeling very much squeezed out. And there are some comments that have been made by the port to those people around this whole issue, which is suggesting that there may be some tactic on the part of the port that's sort of moving in this direction. Can you give us some background as to why this area has been removed from the Banks Peninsula commercial zone, and in as much as it's covered by the Littleton Master Plan, how that can have changed when one of the points in the Littleton Master Plan was the community saying that Norwich Quay should be, as far as possible, retained as a town street? Certainly.
We've received different perspectives on the land south of Norwich Quay that obviously the party, the port, have sought that consideration be given to rezoning that town centre zone and the industrial zone that's south of Norwich Quay to a port zone. Other landowners have sought that it's retained as commercial and industrial, and there's pluses and minuses for and against. The view reflected on the maps is that we need to look at it in a comprehensive. That land south of Norwich Quay needs to be looked at comprehensively in terms of not just those sites zoned town centre and those sites zoned industrial, but rather how that relates to the land around it that's zoned port. And because of the two-phase process we're going through with the review, it's proposed that we treat that area in the review as one area, but not necessarily one zone. So in effect, my proposal is to defer consideration of what that zoning should be until phase 2, when we can look at the port zone as around it and whether some of that land may be appropriate for rezoning for port uses. But again, I'd welcome your feedback on that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the feedback from the owners of those sites that aren't owned by the port is that they would like that to remain, very, very clearly, they would like that to remain as part of the Banks Peninsula commercial zone. And first signals that were sent were that that would remain the case. There are 2 buildings down there, both of which are historic in nature, which will need consents to be raised for repair. And of course, if this zoning change was to happen, it would make those consents quite difficult to obtain, because it would be it certainly wouldn't be a complying activity, is my understanding.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, what we're doing is essentially removing the property rights of those people who have taken steps towards repairing their buildings, and they're going to find it quite difficult to do so, I think.
It's really ensuring that it's looked at in conjunction with the surrounding land, and avoiding us making a decision about these properties without first considering the wider context of the port, which is obviously coming in phase 2. So it's by no means saying it should be port zone, but it's deferring that decision till phase 2.